It is loading, yeah. For me. There.
Okay, now
it's okay.
Okay, so hi everyone. It's a pleasure to be here today with Sturtevant and Kaufman to talk about this book. Some of you may know, some others may not know. And it's called The Devil's Historian. And well, they wrote it. So we're going to talk with the authors about their book. And we're also going to open a debate a bit later. So I would like to thank you both, Poe and Amy, for joining us here in the name of the group Linhas. It's a pleasure to have you here. And well, thank you very much for joining us with all the difficulties of long distance scheduling and communicating.
Thanks so much for having us.
Yeah, thanks so much for having us. And it's nice, if nothing else, to be able to do this now when I know before COVID, it would have been probably impossible for us to really be able to come to Brazil. And so it's sort of one of the silver linings that we're able to do these sorts of things for you.
Yeah, don't get me wrong, I'll never talk about the positive sides of a pandemic. Right. But if there's anything to be scavenged from this one, I think it is the possibilities of long distance partnerships. We managed to get some wonderful ones here. And well, it's much cheaper than paying tickets. So hey, there's that. Well, so with no further ado, let's start with some questions about you guys. So could you please tell me a bit more about your background in academia? Like, are you graduated and masters and PhDs in history, medieval history? Wow, and what was your trajectory? How do you come to be interested by this subject? So you can choose who answers first.
You first or me first?
You go first, Amy.
Okay, so I got my PhD from Northeastern in 2006. I'm looking up because I'm calculating the date. And I was a professor of medieval literature for about a decade. I quit. Which is a long story and probably too long for this lecture, but I'm a freelance writer now. I taught in Georgia and Tennessee, and even though I taught medieval studies, I was very much steeped in American studies, particularly the American South. And so alongside writing about things like Chaucer and Thomas Mallory, I also wrote about the way the American South used the Middle Ages in the Civil War, and in slavery, and in Reconstruction, and the Klan is still very much alive and well where I was teaching. So my interests converged that way, and I got into writing about extremism that way, both through the American South and through the kind of religious revival that's happening now all over the United States, but in the early 2000s, it was just the Southern United States. But the evangelical movement, which also uses a lot of medievalism to stabilize or conscript things like gender, things like race, things like faith. So that's how I got into it.
And hi, I got my master's from the University of York and my PhD from the University of Leeds in the UK. Leeds, I graduated in 2010. And my PhD was really, I consider myself first and foremost a medievalismist, in that my object of study is obviously the Middle Ages, but really in the way that the Middle Ages is understood and used by people today. And my PhD was very sociological in nature, so it was about using focus groups to really understand how people's ideas about the Middle Ages are formed, how people learn about them, not just in classrooms, but through consumption of popular culture and informal learning circumstances, things like that. I worked to try to get a job in academia and ultimately wasn't really very successful because of the crash of 2008. And so I came back to the United States and started working at the Smithsonian, particularly at an office where I've been using my skills to try to understand how people learn learn through informal learning, but not necessarily always about the Middle Ages. So obviously a much broader spectrum. But I use, so again, sociological methods to really understand how people learn about the Middle Ages and how they learn about history, how they incorporate it into their worldview, and how it ultimately really comes out in terms of their ideologies. In 2005, I think it was 2005, I started a website called The Public Medievalist that was really born out of my my interests in public history. So particularly not just understanding how people learn about the Middle Ages, but actually then turning around and presenting the Middle Ages to a wider public. The Public Medievalist has done very well. It's grown from a one-man operation into something where we have had hundreds of articles published by some of the best scholars working today. And particularly our series on race, racism in the Middle Ages and gender sexism in the Middle Ages, both of which are still ongoing, have been, I think, particularly successful and celebrated. And that it was starting in 2005 really, and through that work with the Public Medievalist that I started writing about extremism and extremist uses of medievalism as a way of trying to explain to the public what was going on and what was so terrible. And it didn't start with the Race and Racism series. It started well before that, but it really came to a head with the beginning of that series. And then ultimately that resulted in the creation of this book.
Yeah, we teamed up right after, maybe a couple weeks or a couple days after the 2016 election in the United States, and decided to work together on that series, and ultimately turned it into a book.
Okay, and how did that happen? Like, you just emailed one another and said, "Oh, let's write a book." That was it?
I was initially approached by the University of Toronto Press, who were interested in work in this field. They weren't sure exactly what format that would take, but they were definitely interested in work in this field. And so I turned to Amy, who was my sort of co-conspirator, my foremost collaborator on the Public Medievalist, and we talked about what we wanted it to be, how it should work, and that's ultimately how the idea for this was born.
Oh, that's interesting. So the press asked for it.
Yes.
That's unimaginable, at least here.
Well, it was a lot on the work we had been doing on the site, right? And we weren't sure if it was going to be an anthology, a collection of different writers, but there were a couple of those in the works already by other people and other presses. And I think we decided that what was missing was the kind of introductory gateway into this way of thinking. There was academic work on it, and there was popular work on it, but we were sort of hoping that this book would bridge those two things.
Yeah, like the gateway drug to have your ones.
Yes.
Yeah. Yeah, it's very much in the vein of the ideas that we had, the way that we've been presenting things on the Public Medievalist, of being something that someone who's just starting off an undergrad would be able to understand and appreciate just as much as someone who had a PhD in nuclear physics on their way to work, just as much as a medieval historian, and that the historian might be able to then link it to other discussions that were happening within academia, but that it was pitched at that other level first and foremost, really.
Okay, so just going back to your formations and the things you used, that formation, that word is not right. Background, I guess, would be better. Academic background. Formation brings an idea. I don't know. It reminds me of like military formation. I digress. Have you faced, what are the difficulties of studying such a, well, how can I say, such a topical subject? Especially when your topical subject is related to a very non-topical subject, at least at first glance, because, well, I think most people who aren't well versed in medievalism, even scholars, would say, like, what does the Middle Ages has to do with any of this? Like, there are just some crazy people in the streets who are, I don't know, they like horses and armor, and they put it there, but it doesn't have a meaning. And wow, so what were the challenges, and especially for you, Emmy? Like, you were basically in KKK land when you were doing it. So how did that work for you?
There were two sets of challenges, honestly, and one of them was within academia. So I gave a conference paper, I think it was 2008, 2009, on the evangelical movement and medievalism within the movement. And when I got done, the person running the panel introduced the next speaker as a real medievalist. That's what was supposed to me. So one thing we faced until very recently, like anybody who studied this, we faced a lot of marginalization inside the academy, right? Nobody cared. We didn't have any real knowledge. We were just sort of trying to make ourselves relevant. All that changed with some of the unfortunate political developments in the last 4 or 5 years. That changed. But so that was one of the struggles. And there wasn't until recently any funding in medievalism studies. There aren't any jobs. The conferences used to be very sequestered. So that was one. The other was just having to be very guarded in the classroom, right? So because I was a humanities professor, many of my students were politically left. And I didn't always have to worry about any kind of backlash in the classroom, but we had constant backlash outside the classroom, from people getting angry with me at public lectures to we had conservative groups calling the school constantly, interrogating our curriculum. We had to vary on, I don't know if that's happening in Brazil, but I suspect if it hasn't, it will. Yeah, we were constantly having to justify our existence. That was one of the ways.
Yeah, it is happening here. It's happening for a long time now, and it's getting stronger, especially in universities, with people questioning the indoctrination they do. But well,
yeah, that was happening in the South for a long time, and now in the U.S. it's happening on a national level. I think it's been making news. So.
Yeah, I mean, for myself, never really having formally joined the ranks of academia, it's the challenges are somewhat different doing research of this kind. Particularly, well, I mean, there are the obvious challenges in terms of actually a person's mental fortitude, because a lot of this is extremely distressing and extremely depressing. You have to have a constant supply of, cute puppy photos and things like that to just try to get yourself through. That being able to see the patterns and the connections when other people don't, or other people don't take it seriously, can be very frustrating. Because I know I think one of the first times that a lot of this crystallized was the attack in 2011 of Anders Breivik in Norway, where he fashioned himself into a, for those of you who aren't familiar or maybe don't remember, in 2011, Anders Breivik killed over 70 people in Norway. And he did so after writing a manifesto in which he fashioned himself as a quote unquote new member of the New Order of the Knights Templar Europe. And he scratched in badly transcribed Viking runes Mjolnir on his Mjolnir and Gungnir on his weapons. And that hasn't gone away. That hasn't lessened. I think the terrible thing is that we've been thinking and talking about this for some time, but it's really, people have started paying attention to and noticing this ever since the Charlottesville rally, in at least in the United States, in which medievalism was all over that thing. That people were LARPing as white supremacist knights, effectively, and so to some degree making the case for why this work is important, why this work matters, has gotten easier, unfortunately, because we have something that we can point to. I wish it weren't. I wish we had to work hard in order to say this is actually a problem. But unfortunately, we don't anymore, at least.
Yeah. And yeah, I think the Charlottesville was probably the most notable of all those incidents, even though it was the less bloody one, because we also had the shooter in Australia with the rifle.
In New Zealand, yeah.
New Zealand, sorry.
No,
but we had that, but I think Charlottesville got a lot of attention because, well, it happened in the U.S.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
It also provided very quote unquote interesting pictures because, well, lots of people dressed with shields and that kind of mishmash of contemporary gear like motorcycle helmets and the Viking shield and the Confederate flag. I think that drew a lot of attention, and it surely invigorated some of those symbols, which I think, as you said, they were never. It's not a new thing.
No.
I think
for some time, but
yeah, I think that the Charlottesville rally also really put paid to the myth of the lone wolf. There's this idea that with terrorists that, oh, well, particularly white terrorists and white supremacist terrorists, that they're always couched as lone wolves, as if they are acting entirely of their own volition and independently of anyone else. And the Charlottesville rally showed that the lone wolves are not. That the lone wolves are clearly, that this is not just individual, disgruntled, or crazy people in very big scare quotes, but it is a movement, a movement that is bigger than I think a lot of people realized and recognized and wanted to admit at that point.
Yeah, I want to come back to your earlier point, Luis, which is that it has been going on for some time. It just hasn't gotten a lot of attention, and in particular, I think it really revved up after September 11th. And with the American wars in the Middle East, in sort of the mid 2000s, first decade, I had students come to me and show me, I had a lot of military students. I was teaching in Tennessee, and I had students come to me and show me patches that people were wearing in the military, that were Crusader patches. And they go in line, and people had like secret individual regiments where they, were wearing anti-Muslim paraphernalia and spoke about themselves as though they were in a crusade. And then, of course, we wrote about both these things in the book, but the Islamic State, on the other side, Daesh, they used crusader rhetoric in all of their propaganda. So this has been very much happening beneath the surface. And I don't know that it got attention until it came to American soil, unfortunately.
Mm-hmm. As also often happens.
And then it exploded, right? Because, well, we had white knights in the American South for a long time.
Yes.
And, well, they didn't get notoriety until very recently. If you watch Gone with the Wind, the poem that opens the movie, it's basically, the South is the Middle Ages. That's the point of the whole poem.
Yeah, and Birth of a Nation, right? Which is the story of the Klan. And I will say this, and this is something we didn't, I don't think, go into depth with in the book. One thing that happened in the last 20 years is that the old school Ku Klux Klan in America and the so-called alt-right, who used to not like each other, who used to not get along, decided, maybe thanks to the Obama presidency, that they had enough in common that they could team up. So a lot of what you see now in extremist medievalism is this kind of intermingling of the long legacy of medievalism and the Klan and the alt-right, who's adopting a lot of that rhetoric, who's mingling with them on discussion boards.
Yeah, and I want to reinforce also that we're talking a lot about obviously what's been happening in the past 20 years, but that a lot of this has very deep roots.
Oh yeah.
And we talk about that extensively in the book. I mean, we go all the way back to, I think, the 17th and 18th centuries when we first start talking about nationalist uses of the Middle Ages, and then ultimately adopted by ultranationalists like the Nazis and the slave-owning South. I mean, that this is not a new phenomenon. This is a phenomenon that does have its own roots, and whatever noxious, poisonous fruits we are harvesting right now, that they come from an old tree.
So I have a question. Like, I was planning this for later, but let's change the order because you touched a very interesting subject for me here. Yeah, sure, this is not a new phenomenon. It's been happening for, well, since ever. Like, since we have medievalism, we have political medievalism. I think we can say that. The Middle Ages are political enough. And, well, it takes different shapes in different countries, in different places. But do you think what's happening now in the US, in Brazil, well, I think the whole Western world is facing this recently, this political, I'll call it here political neo-medievalism, because at least for me, it is a bit different. But yeah, do you think it's not new, but is it somewhat new? Like, do you think this new wave of political medievalism, especially after 2016 with the Trump election, Trump campaign, do you think we can distinguish it from those long traditions? Like you said, it seems, at least to me, to be more of a mishmash with the alt-right and to incorporate a lot of meme language, let's call it. It seems to me to be much more of a reproductory product, like something that needs to be processed very fast and spread very fast. And to me, it is, although we share the same root, it is a different product than the traditional political medievalism, like the KKK, like the original KKK, the things they do. It tends to a different public, and it works into different perspective, and therefore, I think we need a different approach to study as well. We cannot just treat this as the same. But I don't know, what do you think about it?
Well, I have two thoughts about that, unless you wanted to jump in, Paul.
I have two thoughts too. So you give yours, and then I'll give mine.
So my two thoughts. One is, I mean, part of that's the technology, right? Whereas an intellectual white supremacy had to be passed around in books, in newspapers and things like that, at a very slow speed, with a longer thought process, such as it was. Now we have the internet, right? Everybody gets thrown together, and everybody's ideas transfer instantly, and so things go viral in a very real sense, right? Something that might have been confined to one group of people in one town now can spread across the entire world, and we have now many countries, yours and the United States, have installed leaders that promote these things, right? And that literally hire people to go online and spread these ideas. So, it's motivated both by technology and power. I will say that even though the technological aspect differs, I do see still some similarities with the Klan. In the sense that, they weren't just a rogue group in the American South. They were governors, they were in the White House, they ran voting, they ran the post office, they ran the police. So that ideology was really immersive. They ran ads in newspapers, they flyered people's doors. They weren't just a small group of people working in isolation, they were a power network. And I do think we really can learn from that. And also, and this is something we talk in the book, Nazi Germany, right? They used medievalism, and it inflected everything that they did, and they had power, and they expanded. And so while the ideas spread differently, I think there are some similarities.
Yeah, I think that my two ideas were roughly similar. I think I'm going to just sort of echo what Amy said about technology, which is to say that that with meme culture and the internet being what it is, and intellectual globalism such as it is, that is creates a new landscape. But just basically saying I agree with everything that Amy said. I think that the similarities. There are some similarities just in terms of how it operates psychologically and sociologically. That it has always been about finding a way to make yourself feel special. That it has always been a way of trying to justify for yourself something that really deep down, I think if you looked at it hard, you would find that it is unjust. It is a way of trying to find a group to belong to for people who might have a hard time feeling as though they belong, or it is a way for people to seize power and to say, this is why I am deserving of power over these other people. That even though it is being done in a different way, I think that these basic psychological and sociological principles behind political medievalism, around power, around identity, around insecurity, around all of those things, around mythologization of themselves, their ancestors, their people, their group, creating of in-groups and out-groups, things like that. All of that is still the same. It's just manifesting in different ways with the particular tools and toys that we have at our disposal now.
Okay, and that echoes back to me, to what you said about the lone wolf. I think, because those people have never been the lone wolf. Okay, some of them maybe, but the lone wolf was never a rule. We had, like, on the inception of the internet, we had Stormfront.
Yep.
The neo-Nazi forum, and we have all sorts of trouble with all the possible chants in the internet because of the same thing. And like, if you go now here in Brazil, there's an internet forum. It's called the 8chan. Like, go there, just go. There's one of the tags is political. Just open. But the first thing you're gonna see is a swastika.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
I bet you. If it's not, just scroll down a bit and you're going to find it. So it's never been the lone wolf, but I think the idea of the lone wolf comes both from the idea that, oh, the terrorists are the other. So it's easy to accept there is a Muslim conspiracy, but it's very hard to accept there is a internal organization. And at the same time, because I think it's because of this acceptance culture, because these people, they portray themselves as very lonely, and sometimes they are. I think it goes back a lot to the problems we're seeing now with the so-called incel culture as well. And the whole idea of manly entitlement, like, oh, I am a man, I should have, like, women, and I don't have those. The whole incel theory about bone structure, like, oh, my bone structure is flawed, so I don't have women, and then I'm going to discharge this hate on this forum here by objectifying and hating on women. That's just an example, but I think it echoes to that, because those people, they do not only portray themselves as lonely, but they operate like the social networks are underground to most standard researches we had up to, I'm gonna say, 2016. At least I don't know any work like before 2016 who was acknowledging Facebook groups as a significant network, for example. Those were seen, I think, as a joke. And then that's my question for you. How do you address this? Because sometimes when you talk about, like, when I talk about my research or things like that, you are met with the inevitable question, like, why are you researching that? This is just an internet forum. It's just in the internet. That's not real. That's not important. And I think still today, with Amazon delivering things with drones in your house, people still believe the internet is a joke. And well, how do we address that? I'm sure some people might think the Public Medievalist is less than a journal because it is on the internet.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So
absolutely. Lots of people do.
Well, so I'm going to pull pull one little part of what you said out, and then we can keep talking about it. But so loneliness and incels and masculinity, I think, that is something we could talk about for hours. But for one thing, the loneliness is the gateway into these groups, right? It's how they recruit. It's also, not coincidentally, how ISIS recruited people in Europe and the UK and America to go over and fight their war, right? They targeted people who felt lonely and disaffected. So the loneliness brings people in. They find a sense of community that tells them they've had something stolen from them. If you're a white supremacist, you join this community and it says you are meant to be the master of the universe, and somebody took that, and it makes you feel better. But incel culture is not separate. Online incel culture is not separate from the way that we construct masculinity in the real world, right? I mean, they are just a magnification of what we tell men and how we teach men to be. And so people don't come in just because they're lonely. They come in because they're having trouble accepting who they are in the face of what they're supposed to be, right? Masculinity demands so much of men, and most people don't fit into that box. And masculinity, toxic masculinity, it deprives men of friendships, of real relationships with women, of any kind of connection and communication. And that in part drives people to these boards. So when you study something like that, you're not studying incel online culture in a vacuum, right? You have to go back to the roots of how it happens in the real world, right? And what brings people in and what the connections are. And I do think that's something we really try to do in the book, connect not just to history and online culture, but to lived experience.
Yeah, and I think that I absolutely agree with everything that Amy said. I think that another aspect of what you were talking about in terms of how do you justify your research to on something that seems ephemeral and inconsequential. I have, for better or for worse, I don't really need to justify my research to my academic colleagues because I don't really have any. But I have found that justifying my research to people who are on the ground actually combating this, that they are far more interested and receptive in what we have to say, because we offer the why behind the what that they're looking at. And so I would say, if you're an academic, if you can, worry less about justifying it to your jerkwad colleague who doesn't think that what you're researching is worth anything. Maybe contact a nonprofit that is actually working on trying to combat white supremacy, that is trying to combat nationalism, that's trying to combat all this stuff, and say, hi, I am an academic. I am studying this. I have studied this. I'd love to give a talk. I'd love to exchange ideas with you, because they have far more real world experience engaging with this than you do, and you have the groundwork to be able to really bring a pool of knowledge to their work. And so I think that to me, at least, is where the really productive connections can happen.
Okay.
Yeah, I'll just say, and this is a little depressing, sorry, I know I'm talking to an academic group, but let's face it, the academic foundations are crumbling, right? I mean, the ivory tower is crumbling, and so if you want to do work that matters, it makes sense that you make connections outside the ivory tower, right? That you try to do something that matters to the world, because you don't know what the university or the academy is going to look like in 10 years, particularly if you're a student. You don't know. If you're a PhD student, you don't know if you're going to have a place in it. So I think doing the work that matters to you is incredibly important, and that matters to the world.
Okay. So just a quick clarification when I asked about how do you justify the work. I was talking less about justifying to academia and more justifying it to the public in general, because I'm not sure if this is sort of a problem here in Brazil, because most of our universities are funded by the state or the government. But there are always some questions like, oh, you shouldn't be studying that. That's a waste of public money. you should be studying things like math, like medicine, and or studying history like Brazilian history or a specific history which is more relatable. And studying this internet thing is a waste of money. Otherwise, I do agree, and I think, if I could say that, academia is, or the current academia is part of the problem of it, because it is basically made to work against public history. It is made to devalue lesser complex work and less complex work, and sometimes we need to be less complex if we want to be understood by everyone else. But well, so that's the question about the general public. And if you ever face this question, I don't know.
Honestly, so for me, because I was a literature professor in underfunded departments, the medievalism studies, studying contemporary culture, actually helped me make the case for the relevance of medieval studies. It was the other way around for me. Everybody was always trying to cut the medieval studies department and cut the classes, and I would be able to come in and say, wait, this is relevant to real life, because at least in the United States, the people with the money cared that it was relevant for real life. They didn't care about the past. With the general public, I think, and Paul can answer this too with his work on the Public Medievalist, I think the key is to make people see how it affects their lives personally. I mean, it seems like a crass answer, but it's always the answer when you're trying to make something relevant and make something matter. It's what I used to do in the classroom, right? I would let my students talk about their favorite video games and look for medievalism there, talk about films they loved or books they loved, or even sometimes, you know, what they did on the internet or their avatars, so that they could feel a personal connection to it. Because even though we're talking about big, huge political ideas and big, huge global ideas, I think everybody needs to connect on an individual level. That's how you grab people.
Yeah, I think that you're always, especially when dealing with the public or people who are politicians or people who think they're politicians because they are a very small king of a very small hill, you're always going to get people who think that if you're not actively trying to cure cancer, that your life is worthless. And whatever, just whatever. That's all I can say about that. I think making it relevant to people's lives, as Amy said, on the Public Medievalist, is the most important thing. Talking to people at the place where they are, in terms of the amount of knowledge that they have, in terms of the interests that they have, in terms of the things that they're seeing around them, the things that they're worried about. All of those things are the recipe for an article to be successful on the Public Medievalist. We don't necessarily chase the news cycle. We very rarely publish things that are actually genuinely timely, unless it's something that is what I tend to think of as sort of a crisis point, because honestly, it's just exhausting. But I have always found that those articles that do the best job of connecting with people's lived experience, their lives, their concerns, are the articles on the Public Medievalist that are the most successful, and then the work of justifying why it exists does itself.
Okay. So just to close up the interview session, about the book specifically. So the book is divided, like we have the chapters. You're not going to read them, but hey, you know the chapters of your own book, I guess. But how did you choose? How did you select the subjects that were in the book and not in the book? Because I imagine you had a vast selection to choose.
You're revisiting a trauma.
Oh man.
So that was the wrong.
We wanted, I think the thing we tried to do, and we did arrange and rearrange and cut and add, I think we wanted to tell a story. I think, I guess that's it. We wanted to tell a good story. We wanted to cover as much as we could on the areas in which we, have been studying or had expertise, but also leave the door open for people in other countries, people from other cultures, to sort of pick up the key points that we made and run with them, right? And keep studying this thing. So I feel like what we tried to do was a basic arc of how medievalism has been used mostly in Western cultures, because those are the ones that we studied, and misused, and the kind of violence that's happened because of it, and then sort of end with a hopeful note.
Yeah. Yeah, and for those of you who haven't had the chance to read the book, it is organized thematically. Each of the chapters addresses one of the facets of the ways that the Middle Ages have been abused, misused by people in the past and present. So we have a chapter that's on primarily revolving around sexism. We have a chapter that's primarily revolving around nationalism. We have a chapter that's primarily revolving around anti-Semitism and Islamophobia. And I think we ultimately, instead of just trying to do one giant arc of history, we wanted to separate it out thematically so that we could identify those strands more easily. But I think one thing also that we want to encourage and really reinforce that we do in the book as well is that all of these are comorbid.
Yes.
All of it's the same people who are white supremacist, as are sexist, as are Islamophobic, as are. You very rarely find someone who is a single issue bigot. And so even though we've organized it thematically in that way to make it easier to read and to understand and see these strands, know that it is a quilt. It is not individual pieces of thread.
And coming back to something you were saying earlier, that we were saying earlier, those chapters are there, racism, Islamophobia, anti-Semitism, because that's the way people experience it, right? People experience racism. They want to know, why the racist guy is wearing a medieval cross. They want to know why the sexist guy keeps calling himself a knight, right? So we organized in part based on people's entry points.
Okay. So, and I guess the final question is, why the Middle Ages? And that's the big one. Kind of a spoiler for the book here, but why the Middle Ages? I mean, sure. Every period has different appropriations. The same can be said about antiquity and every other period. But there seemed to be something about the Middle Ages. And other than we are medievalists of some sort here, so we have an interest shared for that. But other than that, why the Middle Ages and how do we fight it?
The Middle Ages are perceived in popular culture as a time of grand things, right? Heroic men, beautiful women, sweeping religious wars, like big epic things that feel meaningful to us. I think that's one reason. It's certainly not the only reason. But it's one. People are drawn to that in fantasy novels and movies and games because it feels like a big deal. That's a very colloquial way of saying it, but it feels important. And if you assign yourself a sort of medieval avatar, then you feel important. It feels like a time when big things happened.
Yeah, and I think that also some of it is also culturally specific and historically specific. That the Middle Ages were adopted. The Middle Ages are beloved of extreme right-wing nationalists now because the Middle Ages were taken by European nationalists in the 18th and 19th centuries to justify the existence of their nations, and so it's these long roots that the Middle Ages. Have, and yeah, this is something that you find with antiquity as well. I think particularly also because antiquity has this capacity for mythologization in the same way that the Middle Ages do. But I think that especially when it comes to gender, especially when it comes to anti-Semitism and Islamophobia, especially when it comes to Christian nationalism, especially when it comes to a lot of the things that we see around us, it's because these people can find themselves and have found themselves historically represented in a corrupted popular perception of what the Middle Ages were.
Yes, and the nationalists that Paul's talking about, we addressed this in the book. They saw the Middle Ages as a kind of pure, unspoiled birthplace of humanity, and I think because of the myth of the Dark Ages, the myth that everyone is sort of childlike and innocent, but also backwards and barbaric, people see it as the natural state of humanity. And this is played up in nationalist literature and even religious literature ever since the Middle Ages ended. So one example is in English literature is Edmund Spenser's Fairy Queen, which if you haven't read it, I can't recommend it. It's a massive, sort of dull poem. Sorry, Spencer people. Where the Middle Ages is the place that he thinks England should go back to. And this is only about 100 years after the Middle Ages ended, but it's already being portrayed as a simple time full of truth and human honesty, you know, that the corrupted England of the Renaissance should return to. And so that's something that we've seen over and over again, as that kind of childlike origin story of the Middle Ages, which is completely wrong. I mean, it's called the Middle Ages. It's in between things. But it was romanticized that way almost from the point that it ended.
I would even argue that it was romanticized before then. If you look at Malory,
Yeah,
Malory, perhaps the most iconic piece of Arthurian literature that's ever been written, Le Mort d'Arthur, is deeply nostalgic about a chivalry and about an England that never existed. That it is this paean towards heroicism and in a way that doesn't track with any kind of reality whatsoever.
Well, but yeah, Mallory also points out a lot of flaws, and I think sometimes, I did my dissertation on Mallory, but I think even Mallory's work is sort of taken for its heroic aspects, and the villainous aspects, like Arthur killing all the May children, are abandoned. So it's interesting the way that the past gets interpreted. Almost like, you know, the idea of Mallory or the idea of Arthurian legend is more than the sum of its texts, I think. But I do agree with you that Mallory contributes to that, right? He's definitely nostalgic. He's definitely nostalgic for a kind of royalty that doesn't exist anymore.
Okay, I have many more questions, but I'll save those for the Q&A. And so just bonus question, why the Devil's Historians? I think this is the question on everyone's mind when they look at the title and open the book.
Can you answer that, Paul?
We came up with a bunch of titles, and that's the one that they chose. That's the one they thought was best. They thought that one would grab people. Well, I mean, I think that one was one that I came up with, and the idea, yes, just the idea being, I personally feel that as a public historian, I think that the people who are out there interpreting history, whether or not they have a PhD, that they are historians of a sort. That the people who are creating crusader memes online and using it to spread hate, that they are historians, whether we like to admit it or not. But I want to reinforce that they are historians who are working on a project of evil. They're historians who are working on a project that is meant to sow division, that is meant to try to promote murder, that is meant to try to drive people apart, and so that's really where the name came from. The idea that these people, yes, are historians, but that they are historians with a very particular intent.
And we do talk about, you know, real academic historians in the book spreading these ideas, right? The clash of civilizations idea to the historians hired by Nazi Germany, right? We're talking about extremism, but that doesn't necessarily mean we're talking about fringe. we're talking about, full government sometimes.
Yeah.
So thank you, Paul. Thank you, Amy. It was a pleasure talking to you. And now we're going to open for Q&A. So if someone has a question, just say in the chat. I'll give you the word and you talk. If you don't feel comfortable talking in English, or if you prefer to type, just put it in the chat in Portuguese or in English, and I'm going to read it for them, and that's fine. Okay, so we have a couple questions already. Clínio, you can start. You're going to ask in Portuguese or in English?
I try in French, so after all, je voudrais parler en français parce que c'est plus facile à moi. Alors, c'est bien jusqu'à ici? Je peux parler plus doucement. It's okay? It's speaking in French?
Probably not.
I probably will get it. I don't think Amy will.
Here for you, but it might take us 5 minutes longer to answer.
Mhm.
But if you...
So I try in English. I try.
Or in Portuguese, and Luis can help.
Yeah, that's true.
Yes.
Yeah,
I can translate.
Ok, isso plus fácil. Luiz, seguinte, a minha questão tem a ver com a questão da extrema-direita. Eles citaram Charlottesville, citaram agora na explicação do nome do livro. E a questão é a seguinte, se eles acham, eu concordo que sempre houve essa perspectiva extremada. No entanto, eu acho que isso, é claro que tem muito a ver com a minha forma de enxergar o medievalismo, né? E eu acho que tem a ver com o fundamentalismo religioso, que ganhou muita força a partir do século XX, e em minha opinião, eu estou me lembrando aqui desse livro, não sei se vocês conhecem, é um livro italiano, que chama A Teologia do Século XX, do Mussolino Ghibellini, que explica a teologia, inclusive pós-Vaticano II, e todo o movimento conservador que tem pós-Vaticano II. E se eles acham que esses movimentos, ao idealizar a Idade Média como um lugar puro, enfim, teria a ver com o fundamentalismo religioso. Se tiver, por que há poucos estudos de medievalismo e religião?
Okay.
Não sei se deu porque eu acabei de falar, por isso eu queria falar em francês, mas acho que ia ser difícil.
Okay, so...
One hell of a question.
Oh, it's not that big. So let's go.
Okay.
The question
I'm sorry.
No.
is about you already said that political medievalism, and in the way we see it nowadays, and let's say in the 20th, 21st century, it is not a new phenomenon. It goes way back, sure. But do you think it has anything to do, or it has some roots in religious fundamentalism? And he's quoted in a book. Qual é o nome do livro mesmo, Clínio?
Seria a Teologia do Século XX.
A book named The Theology of the 20th Century. And not sure if you know this book.
No.
Oh, okay. So Clínio can send the reference in the chat. But if you think it is related to this idea of fundamentalism and the idea of a more pure faith and this kind of things, and if so, you already answered that it is related. Why are there so few studies about medievalism and religion?
So we have a chapter on this, actually. We have a whole chapter on fundamentalist religions. I think, I'm not going to answer the second part of your question just yet, but I think absolutely there's a connection. And one of the things we talk about in the book is the way that fundamentalist religion, in the sense that it appears nowadays in Christianity and Islam and Judaism, it's relatively new, right? It's reading the Bible literally, or reading a religious text literally and applying them literally is something that only happens in the last couple hundred years. But in order to validate it, people need to go back to the past, and the past is the Middle Ages, right? Because that's when they think the world got religion. So there's often in these communities, there's often sort of the use of the Middle Ages to say, this is where we started, this is where ideas come from, we're going back to the Middle Ages to be pure. Whereas in the Middle Ages, religion is much more complicated. It's much more intellectual, right? There are a variety of texts. So I think, again, because the Middle Ages is sort of seen incorrectly as the birthplace of Christianity and Islam in the way that we know it, I think that's the reason that religious fundamentalism goes back. And Paul can answer that, and then maybe we can come back to the second part of the question, why it isn't studied.
Yeah. I mean, I've been in the book. I wrote a section that's particularly about fundamentalist Catholicism, for example, and fundamentalist Catholicism is a relatively new phenomenon. I mean, that to some degree, a lot of this has tendrils back to the 19th century, where the movements in the 19th century were about sort of recapturing and promoting the idea of the Middle Ages as sort of the time of a purer faith. But really, what you're seeing in terms of fundamentalism in Catholicism comes on the back of the fights over Vatican II and the Vatican II reforms. Particularly the Vatican II's reforms around other faiths and interfaith relations. And so these are people, remember again, these are all comorbid hatreds. And so the people who are fundamentalist Catholics are the ones who look at the reforms of Vatican II and they say no to more equality for women. They say no to the acceptance of Jewish people and the Jewish faith. They say no to trying an attempt at normalization of relations with Islam. And that really has kind of metastasized over the past 40 or 50 years since then. And yeah, I think that is part of it. As for why people don't write about medievalism and religion, I'm not sure exactly. I think part of it is because, for at least from my perspective, I can only speak for myself, it's a little scarier to talk about that for fear of offending another academic and their religious beliefs, because it's something that as academics, I think we don't talk about our own faiths or lack thereof. I think it's sort of the third rail, at least in my experience. And so I think that has meant, at least in medievalism studies, outside of I think Amy's work, I don't think I know of anybody who has actually tackled that. And I think part of it is this fear of causing offense to one's colleagues, especially in the United States, where offense to one's colleagues can mean, so many of the universities are religious-based institutions, can mean that you don't get promotion, you get fired, you get ostracized from your community, that kind of thing. But I don't know if that's experience is universal. That's just my read of things.
I think too, back to I'll do questions 1 and 2 again. For Catholicism and for Islam, in particular, the Middle Ages is a site of actual geographical power. So you see with the Islamic State, when they were big a couple of years ago, they wanted to recreate the caliphate from the Middle Ages, right? The time when Islam ruled great geographical swaths. And radical Catholics often want to go back to the Crusades, right? The time when they believe that their people were fighting for their religion. So there are actual like geopolitical reasons for the Middle Ages too, not just the spiritual ones. And I do think, so I think Richard Utz is trying to introduce conversations about medievalism and religion. I don't know how far he's gotten into it. And there are a couple of religion scholars who talk about extremism. Kelly J. Baker is one. But that connection has not quite been made. But I'll say that medievalism studies hasn't been big overall. Like it's new overall, and it hasn't been accepted in the academy, like we were saying before, until very recently. So that's part of it. You don't study what you can't get a job studying.
Yes.
Right.
I'm just made a comment. Luiz, vou falar em português porque vai te dar trabalho de novo. Não, na verdade, uma coisa interessante é que eles voltaram ao mesmo ponto do Richard Woods, que é o problema de criar um problema no trabalho. Desculpa a redundância, não sei se foi isso que eu entendi muito bem. A outra questão, eu acho que tem uma questão mais de fundo. Primeiro, aí é uma crítica a quem faz medievalismo, porque muitas vezes eles não conhecem muito bem a discussão de teologia. Esse livro que eu estava falando é da chamada, entre aspas, Escola Italiana das Religiões, e ele chama muita atenção para isso, que como reação ao ecumenismo, você tem essa guinada fundamentalista, e mais ainda, se a gente parar para analisar friamente a historiografia, sobretudo a francesa, ela meio que replicou com a história das mulheres, história dos marginalizados. Eu estou citando um texto da Maria de Lourdes Rosa, em que é como se pós-Vaticano II a própria historiografia europeia, sobretudo a francesa, tivesse reproduzido as pautas do Vaticano II. Isso trouxe também uma guinada conservadora na historiografia. Isso sou eu que estou adicionando ao texto da Maria de Lourdes Rosa. Mas eu acho que falta um pouco esses estudos de religião, além desse problema que eles colocaram, que no nosso caso aqui, felizmente, a gente pode fazer. Assim. Por enquanto, o MEC não me proibiu de pesquisar nada, por enquanto. Desculpa mais uma vez.
Okay, so clearly you made a comment about your reply. He said it's interesting that you answered the same thing as Richard does when he asked the same question, basically, that the problem of offending a colleague is a very real problem. Mm-hmm. And other than that, Clinton commented that he thinks this is due to the fact that people who study medievalism usually don't have information on theology and subjects like that, and that makes it harder to approach and touch the subject as well, because, well, you lack the basis for that. And Plínio, você falou da Maria Rosa, como era, que depois do Vaticano II...
Então, na verdade, se você acompanhar pela historiografia francesa, mas ela serve um pouco, não necessariamente para a americana, mas para a europeia...
Vocês follow French historiography?
O que aconteceu? As pautas do ecumenismo, dos marginalizados, de uma teologia política, isso foi replicado na historiografia. Se você acompanhar as publicações, você vai ver que há uma...
The ideas of tolerance, ecumenism, and dialogue, which were proposed in Vatican II, they were also adopted by historiography as well, which caused, in response, a conservative wave of historiography right after. So he also comments that this could be one of the reasons for, well, we're not having so many studies in medievalism about religion.
Yeah.
I'm going to answer a text question in the chat.
Oh, yeah. So I'm going to answer now. I'm going to ask one of the questions in the chat because it is about Clinton's question, and then we go back to the order, okay? So Igor Nefer asks, about medievalism and religion, he would like to ask you, what do you think about this use of history or this appropriation of history who, quote unquote, invents or creates a Middle Ages which is apolitical or perhaps anti-political and also ultra-conservative. So some sort of period where Catholicism was very strong, but at the same time devoid of politics. And this is not in the question now, but I believe this has to do with the idea of politics being seen as a degeneration by some of these groups as well, when they are talking, for example, about elections nowadays.
So politics is a tricky word, right? It's a tricky word. It's very hard for religion to be apolitical. Even saying that you're apolitical is a political statement.
Mm-hmm.
And maybe, you know, that word is extremely loaded, but for me, something that's political is something that has concrete effects on the world. It's so even trying to recreate is in some ways a political act. Now, if you're talking about things that are just for pleasure or just for fun or just for study, I think one of the things we are not really interested in doing is sort of gatekeeping people's interactions with the Middle Ages, right? I think a lot of times medievalism studies can slip into that and say, you're doing it right, you're doing it wrong. One of the things we talk about in our last chapter is that encounters with the Middle Ages can and should be playful and thoughtful, and that there shouldn't be a barrier to experiencing it in whatever way you want. The real question about whether something is political or something is wrong or adverse is whether you are using it to hurt or exclude other people.
Okay. Yeah, I'm not sure if that answers it, but if
I'm
it
not
doesn't,
sure Paul should pick it up.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not sure what else to say exactly. I mean, I might be willing to be a little more radical even than Amy and say that I don't think you can have a study of history that is outside of politics with a small p, like not necessarily about who gets elected and that, you know, not the horse race, but political in terms of with an impact upon our society in some way. That I think that studying, even the choice of what you're studying, who you're not studying, what gets published, what doesn't get published, what gets read, what doesn't get read, all of these are political concerns, small p political concerns. So I really don't think that it's possible. I think that there has been a desire among some people to establish a political study of the past, especially as a sort of conservative response against the way in which critical race studies and the way that other progressive academics have tried to bring contemporary concerns into the study of history. But that's not to say that the way that we used to do things was apolitical. It's just that it was holding up the white supremacist order that the people now are trying to dismantle. So yeah, that's kind of where I come down.
I think there are a lot of positive things to be found in the Middle Ages, right? That's one of the things we talk about in our book. So for example, if you are looking for a Catholic community that connects to the Middle Ages, things like intellectual discussion of religious texts and, communities of prayer and communities of thought, those are all can be neutral, right? The connection to the past is neutral. It's what you do with it that makes it political.
Yeah.
okay, I think that answers it. Knowing who asked the question, I think it was very much about what Paul just answered about this right-wing movements usually trying to construct this idea of an apolitical times.
Yes.
And
yeah,
I that just nails it. Well, so now João Batista has 3 questions. Oh my.
Well.
João?
Let me see. I don't know if I write or if I try to. Can you listen? Can you listen? So the first one, Amy, can you talk a little bit more about the concept of muscular medievalism and the association of this with these nationalist movements? And Paul, at the beginning of the interview, you said that you interviewed some groups to try to understand their relationship with the Middle Ages. Could you talk a little bit more about this research and some results or something like that? And for both, I would like to ask, in the beginning, you talked about LARP, but I would like to know if is there any relationship between historical reenactment and the living history movement and this nationalist white supremacy movement too. I justified this question because enthusiastic of historical reenactment and living history need to study history to perform a good reenactment. And it seems very strange that people who study history in the 21st century linked or connected with this political movement. So this last question is for both. Thank you very much and congratulations.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So I'll start with the muscular medievalism, which is an article I did. I actually wrote it in 2015 and then it got published in 2016. So it was about the Trump campaign and then it became about the Trump presidency, unfortunately, almost overnight. But it centers around the idea that the Middle Ages are seen as a masculine time and a man's world. So we were talking about incels earlier, and sort of radical anti-feminist groups and why they're drawn to the past. If you look at our popular culture representations of the Middle Ages, so Game of Thrones is a great example. What you see is a world full of very masculine, very brutal men and very oppressed women. Oh, sorry, it just started pouring here, if you can hear that. Very oppressed women with almost no agency unless they are somehow exceptional and swinging a sword around, right, like an Arya Stark. So that's very appealing and always has been very appealing for people who want to reinforce traditional masculinity. It was used by the Islamic State, it was used by the Trump campaign, it's been used by conservative religious groups in order to say, if you want to know what a man is and a strong man, look at the Middle Ages. Unfortunately, there's a huge disconnect between what the Middle Ages were really like and even the literary representations we have from the Middle Ages and our modern conception of medieval masculinity, right? If you read medieval texts, there are men crying and fainting and being abducted and hugging and kissing and, you know, being spiritual and thinking through things. Whereas in modern popular culture, we have like the show Vikings, where men are just like urinating in corners and swinging swords and, you know, tearing chicken legs off with their teeth. So that kind of masculinity is what I'm talking about. And the appeal of it today is a kind of backlash against women's rights. It's a backlash against the advances that women have made in culture. It's a way of taking back territory that men feel like they've lost.
And as for the second question, I think I'll find a way. I will find a way to tie it to Amy's answer. I think. First of all, it's been published in my first book, which is The Middle Ages in Popular Imagination, which is out with Bloomsbury Academic in paperback now. So please do pick it up if that's something that is of interest to you. Yeah. So I did focus group interviews with a number of British young people, as I said before, talking to them about their ideas about the Middle Ages, showing them movies, and then debriefing with them about them afterwards. And in terms of gender, for example, interestingly, they had quite a lot to say about medieval men as they were depicted on screen. That in a lot of ways, they were able to say what was a ideal medieval man, particularly a medieval male hero, based on the films that they saw, such that an appropriate medieval man needs to have a certain amount of beard, needs to have a certain body shape, needs to be of a certain age, and project a certain amount of what they called gravitas, which is this idea of an ability to command, an ability to say things that people listen, that also requires a certain depth of voice. And that they need to be sort of big but not too big. They need to be martial but not psychotic. And that this idea of ideal male heroism in medievalisms you can very clearly contrast that with, say, ideal male heroism in, say, pirate films, where men are much more lithe, where men are much more clever, where men are much more sarcastic and able to think their way out of situations, rather than the medieval man who is differently butch. And that's just one very small section of this book and the interviews that we did that was fascinating, being able to uncover the unconscious ways or the semi-conscious ways in which people think about the Middle Ages, and particularly how those really are reinforced through the pop culture that we see. And
I think too, the portrayal of masculinity is very much tied to the erasure of women in the Middle Ages. So you see men sort of taking up the whole screen. It was only in the 1980s that we really started, rediscovering female writers from the Middle Ages, and teaching their text in the classroom and talking about the different ways that women had agency, whether that was brewing beer or running inns or being religious leaders and philosophers and doctors. That's something that story wasn't really told, but it works in conjunction with this idea of overbearing masculinity, right? In order to have the man come forward, the woman has to disappear. They see it as a zero-sum game if you're an extremist. So that's definitely part of the equation. And I think, Paul, you know a lot more about reenactment culture than I do. So
absolutely, yeah. And I can actually connect your next question back to this, which is to say that it was only in the 1980s that we started really rediscovering, such as it were, the fact that medieval women existed. And that one of the difficulties that I know a lot of reenactors have, also having been one myself back in my younger days, is that a lot of times you are dealing with scholarship that is 50, 60, 70, 80 years old because that's what you can afford, or because that is what has been reprinted into the things that are being sold in the actual bookstores rather than in the university bookstores. That's something where it's being sold for $20 rather than $300 and is written in a way that you, as a high school student just trying to understand what's going on here, can actually understand, rather than needing a PhD in order to even be able to engage with it on a basic level. And so to some degree, by definition, a lot of reenactors are dealing with academia on a lag, because it takes a long time for academic research to really percolate out into the public, which is one of the reasons why I'm so passionate about doing the Public Medievalist, because that is an attempt to try to close that gap. That is an attempt to try to get people who are working on the scholarship now to write in a different genre and also for freely consumable, such that people like reenactors can go and actually can have these conversations with their friends. So like I've been contacted by reenactors who have said, thank you for publishing all of this material on people of color in the Middle Ages, because I have had to fight with people in my reenactment group about whether or not it's appropriate to portray a person of color in the Middle Ages in our group. And this has given me the ammunition to be able to actually have that conversation. And so I think that you're right in that hopefully a person who studies the Middle Ages well would be resistant to these kinds of nationalist interpretations. But I think that that's one facet of the problem that we're having and how we're trying to rectify the problem.
Thank you very much.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you very much again.
Thanks for the question.
Thank you. Yeah.
Okay, just a comment. This is this gap you mentioned, Paul. This reminds me of I think it's Marcus Bow in his Thinking Medieval book, like one of the early chapters, maybe even the introduction. He mentions exactly this, like as much as some academics want to believe academia and pop culture are divided, they are not. There's just sometimes delay. But just remember that. Okay, so next question is from JP Ferreira. Okay, so okay, this person is not here anymore, so let's go to the next one. Natalia Luna.
Hi, how are you guys?
Good. How are you?
Great, thank you.
So exciting to hear you talking about this. So, for you guys, how we can solve the problem of the marginalization or no recognition of the medieval historians in the modern society? No, the media don't give the support to talking about these questions about religions or women and medievals. So, how can we solve this or start to thinking about a solution for this? Thank you.
So the marginalization, are you asking about, I'm sorry, the marginalization of medieval historians? Like, how do we? Yeah. That's a good.
I'm not sure I'm the right person to ask. I don't know, but we'll see.
I think so.
I have trouble hearing the questions. You guys hear it okay?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, so just for me, no problem.
Yeah, we're fine.
No worries.
So I don't have an exact answer, but I will say that one thing that's really important is to cross-pollinate your ideas with people who aren't medievalists, right?
Yeah.
In some ways, the academy is set up as such a false construct of little tiny silos of knowledge that don't interact. But when you actually get into teaching, unless you're at an extremely elite university, you know, you're teaching across 3 or 4 or 5 or 6 different fields. And I don't think we talk to our colleagues enough. I've had some really exciting collaborations with colleagues in like postmodern literature, like in post-colonial literature and things like that. And we also don't talk, and Paul mentioned this earlier, to people in the social justice world enough, right? People who have the same goals as we do, but approach it differently. And I think if you want to get the ideas you're talking about out into the world, that's one way you really need to do it, right? Is reach across the borders in the academy, and also reach across the borders outside the academy. Collaborate, talk to people. Because you can publish, like I think we both done op-eds in the Washington Post, and we've got the Public Medievalist, but even then, like, it's not always easy to pull across the aisle and pull people in.
Yeah. As a marginalized medievalist myself, I'm not necessarily sure I have the best answer to your question. I guess it depends on who's doing the marginalization and what to do about it. I think that one of the ways that I've tried to fight against that feeling of being marginalized is by getting my work in front of as many people as possible, even people who might disagree with me. So the Public Medievalist is part of that, but also, you know, when I go and I advertise all of the articles in the Public Medievalist, that I do so in amongst, say, for example, the Facebook groups that I know contain people who are aggressively hostile to me and everything that I have to say, who are full of white nationalists, not because I feel like I'm going to convince them of anything, but because I also know that there are literally thousands of people there who may not necessarily espouse those views. Another is the idea of the public lecture. One of the frustrations that I've had when I was doing the circuit of universities talking about my first book, the Middle Ages and Popular Imagination, and the Public Medievalist, is that broadly I would ask, and I said, hey, can we do a public lecture? And they'd say, sure, great. And then they would schedule said lecture at 4 o'clock on a Thursday.
Yeah.
And it would be freely available to anyone could come, but it was only advertised to other academics. And it's just like, that's not public. And wonderfully, in the Smithsonian, I've actually started doing public lectures at the Smithsonian that are actually public, that are actually advertised out to that anyone can attend, and for Smithsonian members and non-members and everything. And the first one that I gave back in January before this all started sold out in 2 days for 300 people. It was ridiculous. So there is a hunger for, I think, what we have to offer. We just have to find ways of getting out in front of the audience that is really hungry for what we have to offer.
And I think, you know, as disappointing as it is to hear, it's also on us to tell people why our work matters. Like we have to be able to articulate that and communicate that to people who are not academics, who are not medievalists, and say this is why you should care, because academics, we're not really used to doing that, right? We're used to having our work and presenting it and having it already be accepted. But the more time you spend in the classroom, particularly teaching freshmen and people who didn't decide to show up for your class, but they were thrown in there because they had to. You want to get really creative showing people why this stuff matters. And it's good practice. It's good practice to do everywhere.
Yeah, maybe we don't have the right advices yet, but maybe one day. Thank you so much for answering my question.
Of course.
Okay. So we have no more questions. I have a question. Do you have any other questions? Just repeating myself. If someone has a question, type in the chat. I have a question, and I will give you the word, and you can ask a question. So I have a question for both of you, but I think Amy might be especially keen to answer this because of where she works. But, well, here in Brazil, political medievalism, or more specifically, an association of the of the conservative right with medievalism is not a very traditional thing, like at least not until a couple of years ago. Our conservative politicians, with the exception of the TFP, Tradition Family Property, which is a Catholic movement we've invented and we've exported to the US. So I'm sorry for that. But with the TFP, most right-wing politicians and conservative groups would not represent themselves as medieval or knights, and they will use more militaristic 19th century images and things like that. So there is this. But my question is about the US. So I'm not sure, I don't think you can answer me why it's the case in Brazil, but why is it the case in the US? So what made political medievalism so successful in the South, especially before the 21st century?
So that's very much, it's very much originates in the Civil War and the tensions before the Civil War. You can see it in a lot of abolitionist writing. Lydia Maria Child, Francis E.W. Harper, the way that people portrayed the South versus the North was that the North was portrayed as very industrial, very forward-thinking, very progressive, very modern. And they sort of define themselves against the South as a kind of backwards, medieval, feudal society, but the South also really embraced that to say, yes, we are those things, and those things are better, right? We are the aristocrats of the United States. We are the ones carrying on the lineage of the people who colonized the United States. We are knights and we are ladies, and we are much more refined and genteel. You heard those words a lot in Civil War discourse than our backwards northern technocrats. So it originates partly there. The South very much embraced as what it saw as a European and British heritage, whereas the North, and of course I'm speaking in broad terms, right? Like very broad terms. You could find specific examples, either or. The North really rejected Europe and really rejected Britain and said, we are making our own history. We are starting over. And that's part of it. So it originates in part there, and then it grows. I think the South looked backward a lot to define itself before the Civil War and during the Civil War, and especially after the Civil War, whereas the North tried to look forward or in other directions.
Yeah, and adding to that, if I may, it's always also been racialized. It's absolutely been racialized. That both in terms of the North-South divide, there's a great book, I can't remember the author, but it's called Normans versus Saxons, and it's about the way in which the South tried to define themselves as Normans versus the Saxons that they saw in the North, which is, of course, just bullshit of the highest order, but also really racializing trying to the chivalrous society, and I say that again in extremely heavy scare quotes. This chivalrous society was always about justifying and papering over the violence against enslaved Black people in the U.S. and reimagining that relationship as one that is more of a, again, quotes, natural relationship between the lord and the peasants or serfs on their manor, in a way to try to mythologize the horrifying brutality of the slave trade and slavery in the United States.
Yes, which is not to say that the North wasn't racist, because many of the abolitionist narratives written by Northerners were very paternalistic accounts of rescuing childlike slaves from the hellish depredations of the South. So yeah, medievalism happens sort of on both sides. One embraces it and one rejects it, but race, as Paul says, is very much at the center.
That's very interesting, because when I was like writing about political medievalism in Brazil, I've come to a point where it looked to me like there was some sort of a dialectic relationship, almost a retrofeeding, where the progressist field would call the conservatives medieval, and the conservatives would, in a sort of way, they would take pride in that sobriquet, and they would spin it around, and it comes to a point where I think both fields they have like this ambivalent relation to the Middle Ages, where it is at the same time positive and negative for both sides. And so would you say that this kind of relation, so it applies to the US in this case as well? It would be a case, but not the only route, of course, but one of them would be, well, the North was identified itself as more progressive. So the South then, well, just looking for the other model. Oh, is that it?
Yeah, I don't think it's a cause and effect. Like you said, it's very symbiotic, right? Like the rhetoric sort of paints people one way or another, and it's a chicken and egg question, right? We're not really sure where it starts, but it definitely plays off of each other. Another contemporary example of that happening is with the Islamic State, right? Where all the American and British newspapers said, oh, they're medieval and backwards. And the Islamic State said, yes, we're medieval. Like, yes, we want to recreate the Middle Ages, and everybody's on the same page, and they're all wrong. Right?
And an even more absurd repetition of this was with Donald Trump's stupid wall, where the Democrats came out and said, "Oh, this is a terrible medieval idea," and Trump said, "Yeah, it's medieval because it works." And every medievalist just going, "Oh God, I hate all of you."
Okay, Cleo has another question. So Cleo, and anyone else have a question, type in the chat.
Sorry, I will burn you again, but I will speak in Portuguese. Então, Luiz, porque eu não vou conseguir falar tudo isso em inglês mesmo, na verdade tem a ver um pouco com... Hã?
Se for muito grande, vai por partes.
Vamos por partes, então, como dizia o Jack. Não, é o seguinte, na verdade tem a ver com essa discussão de... Com as recriações históricas, esses grupos, que tem a ver com a entrevista semana passada, com aquele papo nosso dessa semana, de que muitas vezes também a gente não ocupa os espaços. Então, portanto, assim, embora eu não saiba como fazer, eu, como um intelectual acadêmico, eu me vejo na obrigação de tentar dialogar com o grande público. No entanto, isso é uma postura, às vezes, no caso aqui do Brasil, ridicularizada pelos colegas, infelizmente. Eu não sei como isso funciona nos Estados Unidos, mas na França eu sei que é também. E, ao mesmo tempo, cria uma situação assim, a gente não tem meios de conversar. E o que acontece? Aquilo que a gente estava conversando essa semana, uma pessoa absolutamente louca, falando sobre a novela lá, Salve o Rei, né? Ter um número de visualizações muito alto, e a gente não consegue encontrar espaço. E como eu sou pessimista, é a última parte da observação, se eles não acham que nós não perdemos o time disso. Por quê? Hoje, esses malucos parece que estão em tudo quanto é lugar. Você digita a Idade Média, essa questão que eles falaram sobre o lugar da masculinidade, eles não têm ideia do que seria essa Idade Média, e eles transformaram a Idade Média na representação de tudo de ruim, só que eles afirmam que isso é bom, como ele citou o exemplo lá do Trump agora. É medieval o muro, mas o muro funciona. Ou seja, esse tipo de coisa. Assim, queria saber se eles já pensaram sobre isso e se eles têm alguma solução. Enfim.
Okay, so let me try to make the question. Okay, so can you please start commenting that? Well, this relates very well to the debate we had last week with Ken Monshine, and it was about problematic medievalist communities in the US specifically. And, well, Clinius says that although he doesn't know how to do it exactly, and this is not necessarily something is expected of him by the institutions, he feels that as a scholar, as an academic, that studies Middle Ages and medievalism, he feels some sort of obligated to have a direct dialogue with the picture, with the general public, and not inside academia only. And although this position is somewhat frowned upon here in Brazil and as well in France, and so he asks if it is also frowned upon in the US, where this is seen as some sort of lesser work or even no work at all. And so that's the first point he makes. And the second point is, well, going back to the problematic communities, well, like the Middle Ages should be fun and okay, but when do we draw the line when someone starts going to a reenactment with a swastika? And okay, that swastika might be historically accurate, but where do we draw the line? Because a swastika means something today, and can we truly transcend this meaning it has today because it meant something different for a very specific place in a very specific time? And the final part of the question is talking about public history, and this is very frowned upon by many scholars still, but did we lost the time for that? I mean, as scholars of medievalism and the Middle Ages, did we lost the timing to try to occupy this space, this public space, just like the Public Medievalist is doing? Because, as Cleo mentioned, we have many people talking about those things, creating this many views of the Middle Ages, and as Paul mentioned, with, well, I'm gonna call it evil intent, with the intent to create something bad out of it. And these people, they seem to have arrived first. So did we lost the timing? So that's it.
So I'm going to answer 1 and 3, and I'm going to leave 2 to Paul because he wrote a great piece about it. Number 1, yes, it is frowned upon in the United States. People are fighting on tenure committees and all sorts of things to get work with the public recognized, but it is unfortunately, and the more elite your institution, the more this is the case, it's unfortunately seen as lesser work. I wish that were not true. I fought against it when I was tenured, but academia is slow to change. It shouldn't be, but it is. And so people who want to do this work are often doing it over and above their traditional academic work. The third question about, whether we've come to this a little too late, whether we lost the time, I think the thing about activism, and this kind of work is activism on a particular level, activism is slow and gradual and incremental, and we don't always see the benefits right away. Even if we caught this earlier, there was no way medieval scholars were going to be able to come sailing in a superhero costume and put a stop to it, right? That wasn't going to happen. But what happens, the change we make is on the level of the individual reader and the individual student. And what we'll see 5-10 years from now, what we're already seeing is a general shift of consciousness. I think video games are a good example. We talk about this in the book a little bit. So the Dragon Age games, I don't know if anybody here is a fan, but in the early Dragon Age games, they had a very restricted, very sexist, very white view of the Middle Ages. And by Dragon Age 3, you've got like people of color as main characters, you've got women as heroes, you've got even a transgender NPC in Dragon Age 3. And that all came from a general shift in ideas about history, right? And ideas about who we are now and the intersection of those two things. So I think it's never too late, but I think that, you know, we need to be modest about what we can accomplish, and we need to be patient.
Yeah, I mean, ask anybody in the social justice world, and they will tell you that people who are in there trying to revolutionary utopists get embittered and leave the movement very quickly. That it is long, hard, thankless work, and you are going to get criticized from all sides, no matter what you do. And so long as you have, I mean, maybe not no matter what you do, but you get the idea. And so the best you can do is to keep your ethical core and to keep pushing. When it comes to the swastika, okay, the article I think that Amy was referring to is the one that I call Schrodinger's Medievalisms, and the idea being that these are symbols that have been appropriated by hate groups that may have medieval origins or other, but we're talking about medievalisms here, that have been appropriated by hate groups as symbols. And the degree to, and the question then becomes, what do we do with them and what do we do about them? Do we ban them from our reenactment groups? Do we somehow try to reclaim them or reappropriate them in some way? My thinking has kind of evolved over time on this since I've published that article, but it is broadly similar in that there are cut and dry cases and there are less cut and less dry cases. The swastika is a cut and dry case. The swastika should not be at reenactment groups because it's like what we were talking about before. It's like when you are reenacting history, just as when you are studying history as an academic, you are choosing what to study, you are choosing what to create, you are choosing what to put on your body. And when you have, as a reenactor, a huge swathe of extant fabric materials from the Iron Age, maybe not a huge swathe, but certainly a swathe of extant things from the Iron Age, when you are choosing to create and to wear the one with the swastika on it, you are doing so either as a wink and a nod to Nazis, or you are doing it in spite of the fact that it's a wink and a nod to the Nazis. You are doing it in spite of the fact that you know that it is going to cause offense among people for whom that symbol is a symbol of the mass murder of their family. And so don't do it. It's pretty cut and dry. I think the only people who might have any claim at all are actually Hindus, probably, because this is a symbol that they have used and continue to use in their religious ceremonies as a symbol of peace. But then people, white people just coming out and making their argument, well, it should be fine because it's a Hindu symbol of peace. It's like, no, buzz off. We don't care. It is also a symbol of hatred and the mass murder of Jewish people, disabled people, queer people. Stop it. I actually did an interview that I never got around to publishing with a representative from the largest Hindu organization in America, and where they were talking very much about their dealing with the swastika. In that there are some people within the Hindu community in America who are very hurt by the fact that they are not able to celebrate the symbol and use the symbol in America, but that by and large the community is absolutely understanding of the fact that they can't. and that they are okay with that out of respect to their Jewish friends and neighbors. Whereas if they were in India, because of the massively different cultural context, that would be different. But in America, they understand that difference, and they respect and recognize that difference. And they have far more claim to it than any medieval reenactor does. There are less cut and dry cases, like, for example, some of the Viking runes that have been used by white supremacist groups and that were used by Vikings. And that is a little bit harder, but I think there is a bit of a hard and fast line that operates where if what you are wearing and what you are doing causes someone else to have that distressed sort of confusion that comes from looking at someone and saying, I can't tell if they're a white supremacist or not. Maybe don't. Maybe just don't. Find some way to make the context abundantly clear to anyone who's looking at it, or just don't, because why?
I think, since I'm talking to a group of academics, I can say this, but it's disingenuous to think that symbols are stable, right? That they have some kind of pure original meaning. Symbols change historically, and they change depending on the context. The context of the symbol you want to use is hateful to a group of people, you don't use it, right? It doesn't mean that you don't understand the original meaning or that you don't know it's been corrupted. But symbols are about the effect that they have in the moment.
Yeah, and it's a question personally of whether you care that you are hurting another person by what you are doing. That's it.
I have a small addendum here, just a quick question to add. But so, the Templar cross.
Yep.
Where does it stand? Because the swastika is the symbol of the Holocaust, and it hurts. And well, now I'm gonna say something that might give it some unpopular opinions. Please try to understand what I'm saying is that the Holocaust was, well, a Western atrocity in Western soil. Kind of, okay. But yeah, mini Western. But how about the Templar cross, which is being used to incite Islamophobia, which is largely viewed as not a Western problem? So do you think we have a higher tolerance for the Templar cross than we should have?
Well, I think, so two things. I always have two answers, don't I? One is, so the Templars were formed to take back the Middle East, right? Like, the history of the Templars is aggressive and colonial and violent. So that, if we're talking about the original origins of something, there it is for the Templar cross. But also, the Holocaust and the swastika has not had the same centuries of romantic treatment as the Templars have, right? So we talk about symbol shifting, right? There has been no popular culture romanticization of the Nazis, and I hope it never happens. But the Templars have had centuries of fan fiction, like, they've had centuries of it. And so the symbol, there are many people who will come to that symbol not understanding what it originally means. They're looking at Dan Brown, or they're looking at, oh gosh, I hope you're reading your comments. But so when we talk to people about something like the Templar cross, which is not immediately obvious, it's good to talk about the roots, and it's good to talk about the ways that it's been altered in film. And I think that's part of the reason we don't react as strongly to it.
Yeah, and it's so pervasive in communities of interest around the Middle Ages. I mean, those Facebook groups I was telling you about before that I throw the Public Medievalist at, I mean, there are the romanticization of the Templars and the other holy orders continues apace. It's pretty disgusting how common it is to find just post after post after post after post talking about the heroism of the holy orders. If someone turned up to a reenactment group that I was a part of wearing a Templar outfit, I would pull them to one side and say, hey, maybe let's like do something else, shall we? Because yes, it was part of the Middle Ages. We're not denying that. We're not denying that there were people who committed horrible acts of violence against Muslims, who committed horrible acts of violence against Jews, who committed horrible acts of violence against women and all sorts. We're not saying that the Middle Ages were this rosy period of complete equality. That's absolutely not true. But it's a question of what we choose to celebrate. It's a question of what we choose to replicate. It's a question of what statues stay up and what statues come down. And that Templar cross on a reenactor's chest is a statue in miniature that really probably should come down.
And I would say its meaning has even shifted, the 20 years I was talking about earlier with the wars in the Middle East. If it was romanticized in the 20th century, it's become a symbol of war and violence again.
It is becoming a symbol of the alt-right.
Yeah.
Yes. Oh yeah.
Yeah, it is.
Here in Brazil, it's very rare for you to see a medieval Bolsonaro drawing, because those exist, just like you have Trump right now. Yeah, we have the same thing from Bolsonaro. And it's very rare to see one of them without a Templar cross.
Yeah.
It has become like a staple.
Because it is simultaneously a symbol of Christian nationalism and Islamophobia.
Yes.
Yeah.
It's powerful in that it's multivalent.
Yeah. There's a lot of that in British alt-right circles too, and it was those military patches I was talking about, the anti-Muslim military patches worn by the U.S. Army in the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. They also had Templar crosses. It's just, yeah.
And in British medievalism, it's particularly difficult because for them, the St. George's Cross is so similar to the Templar Cross, and the St. George's Cross is on their flag. And so it has a nationalist valence as well, that when you're using, is it a Templar Cross? Is it a St. George's Cross? Is it a Christian symbol? Is it a nationalist symbol? Is it a Islamophobic symbol? It's all of those things.
Oh, yeah. I think that the same thing applies for when I was talking about the TFD and their offspring, the Arautos do Evangelho, the heralds of the evangelical heralds, which are also a worldwide group nowadays. And they use the cross of Santiago of Compostela, which is called Santiago Matamoros, or the Muslim killer, translating for a term in Spanish. So I think it's another one of those symbols, which is a religious symbol for many people, but it has also become something else for many other people. Well, do we have any last questions? Oh, you were going to say something.
Oh, I was just going to say that that's one of the reasons why Schrodinger's medievalisms are so pernicious and so difficult, is because with the Cross of St. James, that can be worn honestly and openly by someone who is just expressing their faith. But it is also worn by people who are expressing hate. And the problem comes with, if you are a person looking at that other person wearing that, you have to make a call whether or not that is something that you call out and react to or not, because you don't know what's going on the other side.
Okay, so do we have any last questions? Last call for questions? Okay, I guess no final questions. So, Owen and Amy, do you have any questions, statements, anything else?
I'm so disappointed we didn't get trolled. I was promised trolls.
I am not disappointed.
Yeah.
With this topic, you would think.
I will say one more thing, which is that, there's a lot of doom and gloom in this conversation, and rightly so. But don't ever think that the work you're doing doesn't matter, because it does, right? Even if you change one person's mind, it matters. So don't lose hope.
Yeah.
So, okay, so thank you, Poe. Thank you, Amy. It was a pleasure having you here. And yeah, we didn't get attacked, but I think that's good.
I'm good with that. Thanks for having us. This was a great conversation.
Thank you so much.
Check Poe's stream tomorrow and check Amy's website. Lots of things to be found there. And well, thank you a lot.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Oh, sorry for my questions.
No, we love questions. Don't be sorry.
Clean.
Okay.